Chapter 4. The Community Forms. Once I saw how young people wanted to come and join me, and not just on a visit, but on a permanent basis. Establishing a monastery became a possibility. I had to give them the feeling, therefore, that we were not going to simply use them and kick them out. Towards this, I did my utmost to give them confidence that they were going to be part of this whole establishment one day, when we could set it up more seriously. And people believed in what I did. They didn't need convincing because I put all my faith and trust into caring and looking after people. Those who were at one time dropouts and those who had wanted to follow a spiritual path now had a real beginning, and they could follow it, but it was not easy going initially. That period in the life of this country when Skanda Vale was coming into being was the most difficult and undisciplined time. The people who were coming to see me at the time and who wanted to live in the atmosphere of our community often had very different ideas about spirituality. Drugs were predominant in their lives. Aimlessness was their forte. Discipline was an alien subject, and they wanted things to happen without even moving a muscle. In their minds, everything should be possible, including thinking how spiritual they were, but they were unwilling to surrender their identity to God. You can never draw a line when something begins on one level, then continues on a higher, more conscious level from that of which you started. I would say, though, that this consciousness began to bite when I laid down the law, telling everyone they can't do certain things here. I set in motion very clearly that a monastery to be had to have a structure, and that disciplines had to come about. I said to everyone, this is going to be a community, and if you want to belong to it, fine. But if you don't want to belong, there is a gate. Please go. It would have been a waste of my time otherwise, arguing and trying to get people to do what is required. I began by putting a time frame on people who came to do nothing. If you come, you have to render 4 hours of service in our organisation. Doing this was very important because the Lord wanted me to establish Dharma. I should not allow people, therefore, to simply come and do what they want. That was contrary to the laws of the land. The laws of the land were very much in the forefront of my mind. And if people came to Skanda Vale and broke such laws, then we would have had the police visiting us, which would have been totally counterproductive and lead to unnecessary publicity. So I had to be very, very severe. I would say that inculcating some element of discipline and orderliness, and for people to understand that this is what spirituality is about, was one of the most difficult undertakings of that period. There were those that wanted to discipline themselves, and I put myself squarely behind them. Our work at Skanda Vale required it, and I know what I have had to set in motion to go to the Divine Mother, so why not the others? I showed them that anything worthwhile needed such discipline and careful examination, and this took time. So people came. Some would join us, and being happy, they stayed. Some, though, would fall out with me and leave. Sadly, for reasons of the body and mind, they were unable to pursue their spiritual vocation. They returned back into the world because of constantly looking over the fence, thinking the grass was greener there. There were also some who left but later returned, and they are now with me continuing their spiritual journey. Like this, little by little, the community began to form itself, and now we have a very good structure upon which we are building. The gravity of a vow that a person makes is very telling, because he can't see God. He can quite easily say to himself that though he has made a vow, his circumstances might change. He might still have some emotional entanglements with people, making his faith susceptible to any prevailing situation. When you make a vow, it is a promise. You make it in the hope that you will do your utmost to reach and gain union with God. A mastery of the lower nature is not done in a day or two, or by calling yourself a monk or a nun. It is by learning to be mindful of what worshipping God is all about. And if somebody were to say that is between God and him or herself, then they should have said that before taking their vow in the presence of God. If that were the case, then I would never have administered the vow. That is where Satyam comes into being. The development of the human mind, absolute truth. I will never hold anything against anybody who found a reason to leave Skanda Vale. If the person has not taken vows that have been administered by me, then I can understand. That is what a novitiate is. That is why there is a period for a person to come to know whether he wants to join a monastic order or leave to go back into the world outside. Why should I stop that person? I must encourage him to go because he doesn't belong in a monastery. His mind is unsettled. He has never had much experience in the world outside, so he wants to go and gain more experience. This is something that I have recommended to some of my monks who wanted to join. I have told them, no, go and live for 2 years outside and I will call you back when you're ready. I tell them this because I have an obligation to be honest, not just to them, but to myself also. They can't talk themselves into believing that they can deal with God because they don't know God. And if they somehow use God as a convenience when wanting to become a monastic, they will continue in the same vein, thinking they can deal with God as and when it suits them. There's no such thing. I have no authority to grant anyone any exemption if they have made a promise to God. I can only do so if I am instructed by the Lord to forgive someone because of a mistake he or she has made. However, a monastic who persistently thinks that he can hoodwink God because he cannot satisfy his egocentric nature and that he can have some escape clause when making a contract of commitment with God is in cloud cuckoo land. The only time that I have had any regret concerned one of the brothers, and I should add that my regret was not for myself but for him. He was very undisciplined and aggressive, and he wanted to challenge everybody, including myself. Above all, he was willing to abide by the rules of the community. One day, and I will never forget this, we were having a brothers' meeting, and he wanted to take me on. He was in complete disagreement with me on everything, and was unwilling to accept even one rule of the community. Well then, what are you doing here? I asked. Because I want to be here, he said defiantly. But I'll do things my way. Oh no, you won't, I countered. I'm sure all here will agree with me that to serve the people who come, we must have discipline. We have to have a code of conduct and behaviour that benefits all humanity, and you cannot be exempt from that. I then put this to a vote because I prefer a democratic way, and the vote was unanimous. Having got that from the other brothers, I threw the ball back into his court. Will you now listen to me and what we have all just agreed upon? No, he exclaimed, continuing his defiance. Yet he didn't want to leave the community. Well, I couldn't allow that, so I walked up to him, lifted him up by his robe and tore it in two. I then cast him out. I was not going to allow a single member of the community to be in the community without following discipline. Having done that, I turned to the other brothers, and I could see that many of them were shaken by this because they never thought I would do such a thing. I, though, am a very good actor, and this little performance of mine was worthy of an Oscar. I hope you gentlemen have not been disturbed by what has happened, I told them, but I will never, ever allow anybody here to be undisciplined. And with that, I smiled and walked off. A sense of relief then came into my mind. I had shown the brothers that discipline was the cornerstone of this community. At the same time, I exercised compassion and understanding, because the next day, the now ex-brother came to me and asked if he could stay. Yes, you can, but not as a brother, I told him. Only as an ordinary member of the public. You cannot belong to the community undisciplined. Now that you are no longer a brother, you can stay as long as you want, and I will look after you. Well, he spent about 3 or 4 months with us, going for walks, during which time one of the sisters was beginning to drive me nuts. Not only me, she was driving the other sisters, Annabel and Topsy, nuts too, because she was falling in love with every Tom, Dick and Harry that came visiting us. And when she was not falling in love, she would be constantly crying because she wanted a child. Look, I'm awfully sorry, I kept telling her, but I can't oblige you with a child because I'm a monk. No, I don't want one from you, but I do very much want one. She only had to see a baby in someone's arms for the tears to start rolling down her cheeks. She had this overwhelming feeling inside her that she wanted to be a mother. Eventually, after being driven completely mad by this, Sister Topsy came to me one day. For heaven's sake, I wish you could find a man for this girl, because she's driving me absolutely potty. Well, let's get together and find one, I said. The first person I thought of was the ex-brother, since he was now free. So I asked him if he would mind taking this girl on one of his walks, which he did. He was very quick off the mark and began taking her for many a walk in the woods. In the meantime, there was another non-monastic member of the community who was becoming very interested in her too. However, because someone else was now taking her out, he was becoming more and more angry. I didn't realize this, and I must have been terribly naive. All this time he had been keeping away from her because she was still meant to be a sister of the community. I knew, though, that she couldn't last a sister anymore. What's your problem? I asked him one day, sensing this aggression he had. Of course, the penny finally dropped. He was after the sister. And since she was already being taken out, the whole scenario was getting more than a bit complicated. She, of course, was now being very well looked after. She had the full attention of 2 young men who were both her suitors. Sadly, one had to give in. Unfortunately for me, it was the ex-brother who bowed out. He decided to leave and go back to Belgium, which opened the door for me to have a chat with the other suitor. Now look, I said, since you're obviously interested in her, why don't you 2 get married? She, however, was not ready to become involved with him. Instead, and this was really silly of her, she was falling in love with the devotees. There was one young man whom she fell in love with, and poor fellow, I don't think he had the slightest inclination towards her. Whenever this man came, and he was a wonderful singer from Birmingham, she would go absolutely gaga. She would sit in front of him and stare at him quite goggle-eyed. This went on for a long time, and during this period she wouldn't eat and was walking around looking like nothing on earth. Eventually I had to enter the scene again and talk to her. Now come on, what can I do for you, my dear? Shall I write to the man and explain you've fallen in love with him and whether he has any intention for you? I was willing to do just about anything because I very much wanted some peace and quiet, not just for myself, but for the other sisters too. So with the help of Swami Shanmukananda, I wrote to the young man. Please forgive me for writing, but one of my sisters has fallen in love with you. I would be most grateful, therefore, if you would let me know whether you yourself have any such ideas. If you don't, then I can pass this on to the young lady concerned. Back came an immediate reply expressing his total surprise and indicating his absolute respect for her as a sister of the community. This daft thing, however, didn't know or want to know. She was getting ill and crying and falling apart, and I had now carried this whole conversation to the door of this young man. I had to call her in. Now enough of this. The young man has just written to me saying he has no intention of getting married to you. Not only that, he has asked to be forgiven if he has given even the slightest impression that he was in love with you. She wouldn't believe it. For weeks on end, she wouldn't accept the truth, with me trying so hard to make her come to her senses. Have you got your glasses? I would say to her in exasperation. Would you please wear them and read this letter? It went on and on and on, until one day when the situation was reaching a climax, I called her in once more. Look, the time has come for you to leave Skanda Vale. You must leave Skanda Vale, not for yourself, but for us. You're driving Sister Topsy, Sister Annabel, the brothers and myself absolutely balmy. You think anything on a broomstick is in love with you. For the sisterhood, this is the worst thing that could ever happen. Please go away, go home, go anywhere but find your life. Remember this though, I will not shut the door on you. When you get married, bring your husband and you can come and stay with us. Yes, this was my sisterhood, and I can tell you, I said to myself I wouldn't be having any young sisters after this because of this incredible drama that went on all the time. So she went. She left us and got a job in a hospital. But the matter didn't end there, because after about 2 years had passed, maybe more, she wrote to me. Can I come to Skanda Vale for a few days, she asked. Yes, of course, anyone can come back, but not to stay, I replied. Shortly afterwards she did come, and then once more she went. Finally she appealed to me. What can I do to come back to Skanda Vale? You can't come back to Skanda Vale by yourself, I said. You can only come back to Skanda Vale if you are married. But I haven't got a man to get married to. Well, there is one man I know who's deeply in love with you, I said. The only way to get around it is by marrying him. Oh my goodness, my father would kill me if I did that. He has told me he would write me off from his will if this happened. Well, that is the only way, I said. Tell your father that you really love him and you want to come back to Skanda Vale. Now, her parents had been so angry with me for sending her out from Skanda Vale. They didn't even want to listen to our story and the awful predicament that she had got us into. After a little while, she again came back to me in a state of great unhappiness. What am I to do? She asked forlornly. I personally think you should get married, I told her. As for your father, let's see what happens. If you love the boy, your father will eventually understand the position. I then told her to make up her mind and get on with the job. I also told her that I would give her all the support and she could come and stay in Skanda Vale. An amazing thing then occurred. When she had almost decided to follow my advice, her father died, opening a way for her to go ahead. It was as if the divine was saying, now go on, old girl, get married, settle down. Well, the divine play is such, she did settle down with him, and they lived with us here in Skanda Vale. She died eventually from multiple sclerosis, but the Divine Mother helped her immensely, and she carried on for a long time because of the grace given to her. As for her husband, Russell, when she died, he left us too. They had both been with us since those early days in Earls Court, London. If there was one thing I would never discuss with anyone, it was my family background. Sometimes people would come up to me and start a conversation by saying, I know your family. To which I would immediately reply, how nice for you, goodbye. I'd then walk away. I could be very curt because I didn't want a public debate about my background. Sri Lanka was going through a particularly turbulent time of terrorism, of people being assassinated whom I knew and knew well. It was a dangerous time for me because my family was very aristocratic. It was very well known both for its wealth and prosperity, for its homes and standards, for every single thing that you can imagine. My aunts and uncles were wonderful people. I always look at people around me to see if there is anybody even remotely similar to these people that I knew. and who were related to me. They were socialites who were always dressed up to the hilt. Here in Britain, a family such as this would be seen as someone very special, structure, and so when you came from that kind of influence, it's very difficult to divorce yourself from it in order to fit into a pattern of life that is totally opposite. For that simple reason, I never, ever, ever discussed my background with anyone. I think the Lord didn't want me to. When he told me to change my name and take his name, I can see what he wanted me to understand, that all this is part of the illusionary background from which I have come. And I know with all the troubles that Sri Lanka was enduring, my position here would have been untenable. The prospect of being kidnapped, killed or ransomed was very real. Even today when people wish to know who I am, I tell them I've fallen out the sky. And I would tell the monks the same. On no account should my family background be brought up in discussion, because I knew the extent of danger that would be both for me personally and the members of the community. Whereas all of my family in Sri Lanka have learnt to live with it, I am very much a focal point here. I would sit in the temple fully aware that I could get a knife in my back. I could be assassinated, not because they wanted something from me, but because of my background. And I've been most fortunate not to have people focusing their minds on the subject. Only once did this happen, and this was when a very silly man tried to insinuate that I had done harm to one of our ex-monks. There were only two prominent families in Sri Lanka, really. My mother's family, the Asarappas and the Bandaranayakas. These two families were very close. During my days in London, when Mrs. Bandaranayake was Prime Minister, if her sister Sunethra was in London on a visit, she would come over to see me because we were good friends. Since I was not a fan of the Prime Minister's policies, I would often say some rude things about her sister during our conversations. But our closeness allowed that. I can also recall how, as a child, if we were making a trip to Kandy, we would stop at Haragola, the country estate of Sir John Baron Jaytilaka. For my mother, it was like visiting an old pal. She used to just arrive and go and see the old boy, even up to when he was almost blind. And if she wanted some favour for someone, she would go and see him because he had such an authority. A letter from him opened any door. This is the link of a vast network of influence that the upper crust of Sri Lankan community lived in. Such visits were fun for me because whilst my mother would be spending time with him and having tea, I would be spending time with his wild animals because he maintained a large zoo in the grounds. There was one incident, though, that struck in my mind, and this was to do with our chauffeur. It was getting dark, and there was still quite a journey ahead to reach Kandy. So he appeared at the front of the house to remind the butler that my mother had to leave very soon. The old boy saw this. He was seated with my mother in the veranda at the far end of the long hallway. So he shouted down the hall at the man, demanding what right he had to come to this door. Of course, this was the pattern of life, and it sickened me. We didn't want our chauffeur treated that way. Yet he was almost bodily thrown out for even remotely trying to enter the house. Those days are long past, but even now, when I'm back in Sri Lanka and travelling up to Kandy, I have strong recollections of the heydays when I used to go with my mother to visit this grand old gentleman. What aristocracy does have are some other more notable qualities of perfection, of presentation, of upbringing, of being in command of every situation. My mother, who was a religious woman, who had great perception, was born with such qualities. And I can see the advantage, where others may not, of being in an aristocratic family. You don't fall into the traps that are so prevalent in the life of poor people who are aspiring to be spiritual. Yes, Christ was born in a humble setting, but I would say that it fitted for that period. Because you have been born with all that you have got, you don't hanker after anything. You have the advantage of knowing pretty well that you won't let people down. People look to me as having started the community, and at no time will I allow myself the luxury of letting its members down in order to be involved in some superficial rubbish, whether materialistic, emotional, whatever. That discipline is flowing through me because of belonging to a very special set of circumstances. I cannot break that mold. I have no right to break that mold because I relate myself to Lord Subramanium. My allegiance is to him, and I concede that the allegiance from the family tree is the same as it is with God in that context. I can also have appreciation of people who have evolved into being born into a privileged position. They have earned that by what they have done and do not misuse the opportunity of birth. I see people being born and being successful in the lifestyle and pattern that they have inherited, and they have also received grace because of karma for their achievements in their previous incarnations. So why should anybody be envious of that? Everybody is the recipient of grace that he or she has earned. It was my mother who taught me about presentation, that you should dress and present yourself in an immaculate manner. I never ever saw my mother dress shabbily. I can remember the last time she came to see me, and she was almost 80 by then. She came down the gangway of the plane dressed all in white, a white sari, a white blouse, a matching scarf and a white handbag. She was also wearing a pair of beautiful high-heeled shoes, and I thought to myself, my goodness, this woman hasn't even remotely lost any of that gloss which she had before. You have to have that feeling of excellence within yourself. And I taught that to all my monks. Wear a robe, but for heaven's sake, make sure it's ironed when you present yourself. People are going to look at you and you represent the community. My mother visited us twice when the community was still in its infancy, and even in those early stages, we would wear dhotis and present ourselves in a monastic style. She saw this and would tell me, darling, you make me very proud, the way you dress. And today in the community, it is I who am very proud when the Swamis dress up, because they've learned to present themselves as representations of the Lord. We represent the Lord, the highest embodiment of goodness, and it doesn't stop at that. You integrate with God. Your integration can only occur if you maintain the quality of excellence in every avenue of your life. When you wake up in the morning, you don't suddenly wear a different mask. You wake up in the morning the human being you went to bed as, and then you carry that through. I look at people to assess what amount of control and power the person has got in his mind. I sometimes play with them, showing them the power I have. This is a fascination for me, that you are the Lord's representative and endowed with all the energy and power, the Shakti of the divine. And when I play with people, it's not to degrade them. I'm saying to them, come on, you can do the same as I'm doing. The difference is you're not conscious of your own faculties. I play so people can learn that which is endowed in them in spiritual terms is a grace that God gives them. But they have to use it wisely. There is a big difference from being simply arrogant. You're learning to use all the qualities of grace and opportunity in the path of evolution. And you are learning how to master yourself to use them, because you never, ever cause displeasure to somebody else because of your spiritual personality. Never. People use the terminology humble, but the word in my mind doesn't quite fit the role. God isn't humble. God is almighty, with all the power and grace and qualities of excellence and authority. He doesn't walk around with his head tucked between his legs. He's ever present, omnipresent, and it is the excellence with which the human being has got to learn to work. Whilst living in Earl's Court, I had been caring for a lot of people, including those taking multiple types of drugs. As a result, I came to be known by the establishment as a place where if they wanted any help, they could come and refer patients to me privately. They did this because the patients they were treating were from very rich families, so they had to be treated anonymously. One such person I got to know in this way was Dr. Patterson. She was a very charming lady involved with the aristocracy and those who were taking drugs. When people have money that they don't know what to do with and they start taking drugs, they have to be very careful. They have to spend a lot of money quietly, far away from publicity. Because if the press even smelt that a certain person was taking drugs, that person would have got into terrible trouble. Somehow she managed to run her private clinic for such drug addicts, free from press intrusion. And when she thought she had a difficult case, she would refer it to me. The person would then come and talk to me. And it was very sad, because they were young boys and girls. I think it was the saddest thing I encountered in my life, because it was such a waste of life. A waste of not being able to use their faculties properly. I would take them on, and by this time I'd moved to Skanda Vale, and she would send them to me to stay with me here in this remote part of Wales. It was wonderful because they now had the chance for rehabilitation well away from the influence of not only the drugs but also the junkies and dealers. However, after about 6 months or so, they would return back to their lifestyle of affluence and not knowing what to do with themselves, quickly slopped back into the drug culture. They did this because they had money, and the society they were involved in was all about drugs, drinks and everything else, which to my way of thinking I regard as deprivation. There was one case. He was a close associate or relative of the members of the first house in Britain, and he came and spent about 8 months with me. When he was better, he announced he would go back and resume his life in the world outside. Yes, of course, I said, you must go back to your normal life. This is not a hideaway for anybody, but a place of rehabilitation. I knew why he was wanting to leave, because he had become agitated. He felt that he had now gained sufficient control of himself, and so wanted to go out into the world again. I also knew that without the disciplines that we have here in Skanda Vale, he would soon be taking drugs again, and there wouldn't be a chance in hell that he would survive. That's exactly what happened, and he died. I have seen people die from excesses of drugs, and there is nothing in the world you can do except capture them and keep them in seclusion. But how can you keep people in seclusion indefinitely? Yet you know, as soon as they return back to the outside world, the dealers will begin tempting them in order to make money out of these people. They don't realise that, and I have had to be very, very strict here that no one ever came to Skanda Vale with drugs in their possession. I recall one day there was a young man who came to us, and we had our rules well set out by them. He was from a nearby community known as Skanda Vale, and I put a ban on this community from coming and staying in Skanda Vale. The only reason I gave them was that since they lived within 25 miles radius of Skanda Vale, they could easily return to their homes. We would happily give them all the refreshments and care that we could offer, but they had to go back. I didn't want them to stay though, because I feared some of them transacted with drugs and money. I asked this individual, therefore, whether he had read the rules of the community, and I asked this because I knew he had drugs on him. Yes, I have, he told me. So then I inquired whether he had drugs on him. No, I don't, he said. I don't take drugs. Look at my face and say that again, I said. I don't have any drugs, he replied. Again, I asked him to look at my face and repeat what he'd said. But I have no drugs, he insisted. I looked at him very carefully. But you do have drugs, I told him. There's hash in your pocket. This flummoxed him. How do you know what I've got in my pocket? I know every single thing about you, I said. Now, if you want to stay in Skanda Vale and enjoy the benefits of Skanda Vale, you have to hand that hash over to me, and I will tell you exactly where it is on your person. I then pointed to it. It's there in your left-hand pocket, and if you want to stay, you must give it to me. The look on his face turned from bemused indignation to horror. that I had such access to him. Grudgingly, he put his hand in his pocket because this was money he had just spent, and he was hoping that by concealing it, he could consume the drugs here in Skanda Vale. He then held it out in his hand. "This cost me a lot of money," he said, feeling aggrieved. "It's going to cost you more than money if you take it," I told him. "Your brain is going to be affected by it. Your body is going to be affected by it. And if you regard that as spirituality, you're living in cloud cuckoo land. Now give it to me if you want to stay in Skanda Vale, or you must go." So giving me a sheepish look, he put the hash in the palm of my hand. "What a tragedy," I said to him. "When people are hungry and people are desperate for a home, you spend your money on this horrible stuff. There's only one place for this. Follow me." And I turned and walked down the passage of the dining room towards the toilet. "What are you going to do?" he said, his voice rising in alarm as he followed me. Ignoring him, I walked into the toilet and very ceremoniously I dropped the hash down the bowl. You've no idea, this caused an eruption of screams from him, the gist of which was about how much this had cost him. I pulled the chain and off it went, down into the cesspit. "You're the cruelest man I've ever met," he shouted. "No, I'm the kindest man you've ever met in your life. Go tell your friends from Teepee Valley and elsewhere. There is this terrible guru living in Skanda Vale who knows what is happening there. And be warned, don't come back here if you're bringing drugs." And I did this, and I became known as the terrible guru. And I enjoyed that title, because people like this individual did stay away. His experience with me made them understand that the horrible vibrations they were setting in motion were quite visible to me. Nothing misses me. This is absolutely true, even to this day. Nothing misses me when I enter the dining rooms. That is why I come down. It's my duty to maintain that height of awareness and not be fooled by people's appearances. I don't want a different agenda for the community. We have not had any adverse publicity about drugs in Skanda Vale because we have never allowed them onto our premises. I would not hesitate, if required, to bring in the law, and people know that, because I have no intention of devaluing the spiritual work that I have been doing. Excellence is my job, and excellence I will retain and maintain through all my working life. Often, people get unnerved at the thought that I can look into their minds, which in fact is such a simple thing. Every action has a reaction. Everything is a vibration. If you are hypersensitive and your brain registers impulses, then you pick such vibrations up. And the more someone tries to conceal something, the more energy is put into that concealment. And that is a vibration that is visible to me. It's just like a lie. The more someone tries to conceal a lie, the more visible it is because it's a vibration. Not only that, you can see it registering on someone's face. It starts to become distorted, screwed up. What people fail to understand is there is a reason why a guru has insight, and it is not to persecute that individual, but to help him out of the predicament that he is in. Nor is it to be judgmental. You can't judge anybody, because in the path of evolution, what hasn't a person done? No, I am here to give assistance to people and hold a mirror to their face. I do this so that they can recognize within themselves the obstructions that they are creating, which is separating themselves from Almighty God. It is not to prejudge or preempt anything, because if God is willing to understand the human being, who am I to tell someone this is a terrible thing you're doing? Apart from the act of killing, every single thing in life has some mythology concerned with learning a lesson. Everything is about learning, being educated through life. And so if I can accelerate the learning process for a human being to render some assistance, I am deeply indebted to Almighty God that I am able to do so. If a person is blind, you help him cross the road. If a person falls down, you pick him up. If a child is about to be knocked down by a vehicle, you rush to its assistance as if you are its mother. There's no separation. If you serve God, you serve God. There is no hocus pocus, mumbo jumbo with that. Modern day saints like Mother Teresa of Calcutta weren't judgmental. Her compassion and love enveloped everybody, and in my mind she is a great example to follow today. She had within herself a very good discipline, the order she set in motion. Many people came to work with her, and it is important that her followers don't lose sight of the purpose of what she was doing. She was about service without thinking. You just do it. What is there to think about? God won't wait to be told that such and such a person is hungry. God won't wait to be told that someone needs clothing and shelter. It is this perception of great sensitivity that enables you to serve God in humanity and life as a whole. I find I have learned much from my service to the animals in Skanda Vale. We have the oldest cattle living with us. We have got some wonderful animals here, and our community would never be successful as a spiritual centre if the monks and nuns did not serve and care for life. There is no purpose in just having a temple. The temple of the heart and the temple of action go together. The temple of action is to serve God. That is the temple. The real temple is in there, in your heart. If you have no love, how on earth can you know God? You have no space and time for God. Your ego is so wrapped up in yourself that there is no space and time for God. I, though, have space and time for understanding, because in the path of evolution, the purpose of our birth is to discover our divinity. And we must give every opportunity to that person, irrespective of class, creed, or any particular religion, to be served by us. Love is the hallmark of spirituality. Love is God. God is love. It is not a cliche. It must be pulsating in your veins. It cannot be clinical. If there is any element of it being clinical in a monk, I know it. And then the drama begins between that person and me. I have thrown many a monk out of Skanda Vale purely and simply because that person does not belong to the army of the Lord. Obedience is absolute. Because of that absolute obedience to God, God has taken me over lock, stock and barrel in my mind and body. I function because of the Lord. I live because of the Lord. I drink and eat because of the Lord. For the inspiration is the energy of God telling me how to make Skanda Vale's service to humanity even better and providing all the resources. My confidence in God is the development of the mind and the surrender of the human being. Total and absolute surrender.